Sleep is wonderful, and it's essential to life. The better we sleep, the better we concentrate, the better we make decisions, and the better we perform. Sleep minimizes the chance of making errors on shift. Better sleep makes us better learners as well. It plays a key role in consolidating both declarative and procedural memory. Better sleep means better adaptive capacity to stressful situations, which are plentiful in EM, of course. And the better we sleep, the better mood we're in, and the better our relationships. The better we sleep, the lower our chances of developing cancer. The better we sleep, the lower our chances of developing heart disease. The better we sleep, the lower our chances of developing depression, and the longer we live. Yeah, more sleep is associated with a decreased mortality rate. So the better we sleep, the happier and healthier we are. And as we're all too familiar with, shift work disturbs our wonderful sleep because shift work messes with our circadian rhythms and our sleep drive. And messing with our circadian rhythms and our sleep drive is not trivial. Besides all the long-term badness, our chance of being involved in an MVC on our commute home is much higher when our circadian rhythm is messed with. I'm embarrassed to admit that I smashed up my car on my commute home after an overnight shift early in my career. But since then, I've learned a few things about sleep, and I think it's made me healthier and happier. Yet, I still feel I need to up my sleep strategies to the best that they can be. And I have so many questions about how best to optimize sleep for shift work. So I invited a sleep expert to give us some evidence-based answers to some practical questions and give us some solutions so that we can sleep better and live better. Dr. Michael Mack is a sleep medicine specialist and staff psychiatrist at the Centre for Addiction and Mental Health in Toronto. He's an assistant professor at the University of Toronto and adjunct research professor at Western University. He has a passion for medical education, winning multiple teaching awards, and he's a fellow of the American Academy of Sleep Medicine. Welcome to the Emergency Medicine Cases podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Anton Hellman, bringing you the brightest minds in emergency medicine from around the world. EM Cases is brought to you by SHREMI, the Schwartz-Riesman Emergency Medicine Institute. That's a nonprofit organization dedicated to improving EM care through high-quality research and education. The opinions expressed on this podcast are intended for information and education purposes only and should not be used to diagnose, treat, or prevent any medical condition, nor should they be used as a substitute for medical advice from a qualified practicing physician. First, just a quick word from our sponsor, Metricade, the experts in complex physician scheduling since 2012. I've been using Metricade's incredible scheduling system for more than a decade, and it's been a game changer for me and my colleagues. Shift work comes with its challenges, but Metricade helps minimize the drawbacks by ensuring fair distribution of shifts while integrating circadian rhythm-friendly recovery time into its methodology, preserving your precious sleep so that you can perform at your best. Go to metricade.com/emcases to see how Metricade can make your scheduling fair, improve your sleep, and your performance. That's metricade.com/emcases. This episode is brought to you by Easy Resus, the resuscitation assistant. This amazing app has drug dosing, equipment size calculation, treatment algorithms, all in under 3 clicks. Rapid access to life-saving critical info in a user-friendly interface. Try the app for free with the promo code EMCases or visit easyresus.com/EMCases. That's easyresus.com/EMCASES. Welcome to EM Cases, Dr. Mack.
Thank you for having me.
All right, before we dive in, Mike, do you have any financial conflicts of interest, like with sleep medications or anything like that?
Yeah, and they're as follows. I receive unrestricted educational funds from Paladin, Eisai, Jazz Pharmaceuticals, ResMed to fund our sleep medicine fellowship in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Toronto. Because right now, apparently it's a faux pas to allow people to self-fund, i.e. work shifts in a psychiatric emerge or the outpatient clinic to fund their way through fellowship. We have to give them their salary up front. I received Speakers Bureau from Eisai, Idorsia, and Paladin. I've done consulting for Jazz, Eisai, and Idorsia, and I'm a shareholder of Eli Lilly and ResMed.
All right, great. So we're not going to get into any details about any sleep medications, but there are a lot of other topics to cover for making our sleep better. And so let's dive into a deeper understanding of how sleep affects our performance on shift and get some practical sleep hygiene principles and strategies based on the science that's out there. So first, I think before we dive into the sleep hygiene principles and strategies for shift work, I think we need to understand a little bit about the physiology of sleep to help inform those strategies. So can you just give us sort of an overview of the physiology of sleep related to good sleep hygiene and shift work?
Yeah, that's a great place to start off. Well, there are two processes that drive sleep. So the first one would be process S, which is sleep homeostasis. We've all had the experience of working 24-hour shifts, and you'll know that that version of yourself that's been up for 24 hours is necessarily sleepier than the version of yourself that only did, let's say, an 8-hour shift. And that's because the longer period you're up for, the greater amounts of adenosine build up in your brain. And that is what drives the sleep homeostasis. The longer you're up for, the sleepier you become. So that's process S. Process C is the circadian process. And that's regulated by the light-dark cycle of the external environment, which feeds into receptors in our eyes, outside of rods and cones for light and color. There's also a third set of receptors in the retina. These receptors have melanopsin. They're called melanopsin receptors, and essentially they respond to light exposure from the sun and from artificial lighting since the dawn of that. And basically, there are times where it makes sense to be sleepier, and there are times that make sense for us to be more awake and alert. And in general terms, when the sun is out, we're going to be the most alert that we can be. And when the sun starts to set, that sets up the stage for our internal body clock to tell us to become sleepier. So that's the two processes that drive sleep, process S and process C. The two processes together, the net outcome is what we see in daily life, which is most people end up sleeping 7 to 9 hours. If you're an adult, if you're 65 and above, you sleep 7 to 8 hours. Most of us become sleepy or start to become sleepy 2 or 3 hours after the sun goes down. And we wake up when the sun comes up the next day.
All right. So essentially, you've got your circadian rhythm, which is sort of your master clock. And then sleep drive is the adenosine buildup. What about cortisol? Because that's driving our sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. How does that play into sleep?
Yeah. What we see is that a person's cortisol levels peak in the early morning, and they actually peak just maybe the 30 to 45 minutes after the person wakes up. And then thereafter, the cortisol levels slowly decrease, down to basically a low before you go back to sleep again. The surge of cortisol that occurs in the morning is a means for your brain and body to prepare itself for any sort of obligations or, stressful things that you have to deal with during the daytime. So I wouldn't say that the cortisol is a driver of sleep, but it's a consequence of what you have to do in terms of sleep and wake life obligations.
All right. So I think our listeners will see how some of these pathophysiologic mechanisms will come into play big time when we start talking about strategies. I want to move on to basic sleep hygiene principles. So what do I mean by basic sleep hygiene principles and strategies? So I mean what we do or do not do before sleep, during sleep, and after sleep, essentially. And some of the things I want to cover here are the timing of sleep, lighting and screen use before sleep, eating, drinking, alcohol, noise, ambient temperature during sleep and when you wake up, wind down routines, and of course, caffeine. So let's start with timing of sleep. So basic sleep hygiene principles that I learned when I was in medical school said that, you should go to bed the same time every night and wake up the same time every morning. I don't know if that's still true. That was because my medical school was a long time ago. In terms of timing of sleep, first of all, how much sleep is ideal? What time should we really fall asleep and what time should we really wake up? And should we use an alarm clock to wake up the same time every morning? Like what about the timing of sleep?
Yeah, let's talk about duration. You mentioned duration first. So the younger you are, the longer your sleep duration is required, purposes of growth. Now, for adults, let's say aged 18 to 64, then the recommended sleep duration for those folks is 7 to 9 hours. But that's going to be a bell curve. You're going to have lots of folks on the left side of that bell curve, lots of folks on the right side of the bell curve. And part of that is most of that is going to be set genetically. The other half would be behavioral things like, if you're working in emergency medicine, then your obligations take precedence. You'll force yourself to maybe, attenuate, maybe shorten your sleep duration compared to what is recommended. But for most folks, it means they need to sleep 7 to 9 hours to feel refreshed, to have the fully restorative properties of sleep to engage. In terms of timing, waking up every day at the same time is the best advice that we can give anybody as it pertains to sleep hygiene and healthy sleep principles in general. Because your wake time is a proxy for your first bright light exposure, sunlight exposure, and artificial light exposure. And that's what actually allows your internal body clock to set the start of the next 24-hour cycle. It's important to regularly receive light exposure first thing upon awakening and to keep that consistent. because our internal body clock, the circadian duration is actually longer than 24 hours. Some people think it's 24.17 hours. Other people think it's 24.3 hours. Long story short, without Zeitgebers, sign givers, which are, external stimuli that allow our internal body clock to entrain with the light dark cycle external environment, of which the most powerful stimuli is light. If we didn't have these Zeitgebers, we would sleep later and wake up later, progressively speaking, such that a person would be upside down if they didn't receive external stimuli to entrain their internal body clock. So waking up every day at the same time in the morning is crucial so that it reduces any sort of social jet lag and minimizes the health concerns with, having a mismatch between your internal body clock and the external environment. Your sleep time, though, I'll just make a modification. Your sleep time can be any time. It doesn't have to be the same time, night on night. It really is dictated by when you feel sleepy. And when I say, it's dictated by, when you feel sleepy, it's that head nodding sensation that we get. If we've been in a meeting for 45, 46 minutes and you look around, sometimes people have that head nodding feeling, and that's in contrast to fatigue. Fatigue is a body sensation. It feels like, you've done a 12-hour shift. You went to the gym thereafter. Your body feels broken. You don't want to stand up. You want to sit on a couch and just watch television. So that's a physical feeling as opposed to sleepiness, which is that head nodding, irresistible sleepiness kind of feeling. It's hard to keep your eyelids open. That's the type of feeling that should dictate when you go to sleep at night, because that time is going to be different from night to night, depending on what you did during the day. So if you had a long shift, you went to the gym for a long period, you did something physically or mentally strenuous, you might feel sleepier earlier on those nights compared to days when you were just totally relaxed. So if you force yourself to sleep at the same time night to night, it's a recipe for insomnia, because on those nights where you're not as sleepy, you're going to be up, until you feel that head nodding feeling. That's going to be extended artificially.
Ideally, we want to wake up the same time every morning and get exposed to some good light, whether that's artificial or not, every morning. And then we should go to bed when that head nod, eyelid close feeling happens, no matter what that time is. So that's our ideal situation. We'll talk a little bit later about how we need to modify that for shift work, but that's good to understand. All right, I want to talk about preparing for sleep. So what should we be doing before sleep so that our sleep architecture is the best that it can be? In a past podcast, we talked about diet and sleep with Dr. Melody Ng on a previous EM Quick Hits podcast, but I think it's worth exploring here. What kinds of foods should we or should not eat? How long before we go to sleep should we eat? And we'll talk about drinks and caffeine and other stuff as well before sleep. But let's start with preparing for sleep in general and what kinds of foods we should and shouldn't eat and the timing of those foods.
Mm-hmm. In terms of preparing oneself and optimizing yourself for the best sleep possible, what you're going to want to do is to have a consistent nighttime wind down routine that you keep consistent from night to night. So for most folks, there's going to be some sort of ritual that you do before you go to sleep. That can include grooming, taking a shower, or taking a bath. What we want a person to do is to do those things, those, very soothing, wind down activities. We want them to do those things, but we don't want a person to do things that increase one's mental or physical arousal. So, working on exercising is great for health and sleep health in general, but you don't want to do that too close to your bedtime. So we would advise folks to avoid strenuous exercise, let's say at least 3 hours before their bedtime, because otherwise it's going to take a long time for your autonomic system to go back to rest. Other things that we don't want a person to do would be to do things that are too engaging. So I know a lot of us like to read before we go to sleep. And maybe for the people that are genetically blessed, they're blessed against the possibility of insomnia and sleep disturbance. That might be fine for them. But, for those of us who are more sensitive to sleep disturbance and shift work changes, then probably you don't want to go to sleep, read an interesting book or a magazine before you go to sleep, because then you might actually finish your book or you might finish your magazine before you go to sleep. And that might be, an additional 30 to 60 to 90 minutes that you could have otherwise just optimized your sleep. So on the subject of eating, I don't think it's fruitful to focus too much on what kinds of foods that you would prefer to eat at different times of the day, although there's a lot of research actually being done, particularly from our colleagues from Northwestern University in Chicago, looking at optimal times of eating as it relates to sleep, health, and optimization. But the general rule is that you're not going to want to eat a big meal close to your bedtime. Doing so is going to interrupt your sleep. It's going to make it hard for you to fall asleep. So eating consistently and eating healthy foods is always great, but again, not too close to bedtime. And again, I would tell people try not to have a big meal 3 hours before their bedtime.
Okay, great. So no exercise 3 hours before bed, no big meals for 3 hours before bed. And if you're going to read something really boring. Yeah, don't read something that's going to get you all excited and that you're going to keep reading after you get that feeling that your body wants to fall asleep and stay up late just to read. All right. What about liquids and timing of liquids? And I want to talk about caffeine, alcohol, and other beverages. So let's start with caffeinated beverages. So I've heard that if you're a slow caffeine metabolizer, that you shouldn't drink even 12 hours before you're going to go to sleep. I've heard 6 hours is a good general rule before you go to sleep, not to drink any caffeine. I have colleagues who, drink gallons of coffee every day. And then I have others who won't go near it because they get jittery. I prefer matcha myself because that avoids the whole jittery feeling, but it has this added benefit of this kind of calming effect, which is great for a stressful environment like the emergency department. What can you tell us about caffeine, about the timing of drinking caffeine, the amount of caffeine, and how caffeine interacts with our sleep?
You pointed out the different, factors when it comes to caffeine use. Strategically timed and strategic use of caffeine for one's performance and cognition is obviously a great thing. Particularly if we're tasked to work when it's dark out and try to sleep when it's light out. When we're trying to be most alert when it's dark out, we're upside down, with our internal body clocks. So that in that situation, that's going to be helpful. But let's talk about caffeine use and optimizing one's sleep. So we know that caffeine is a wake promoting substance. The way that it works is it displaces adenosine. And by doing so, artificially provides greater alertness for the duration it's active. So they've done controlled trials looking at how caffeine that's administered at different times of the day affects nighttime sleep. So you're absolutely correct. The minimum cutoff that we would tell people if they're really interested in maximizing and optimizing their nighttime sleep is to give yourself a 6-hour leeway between your last caffeinated beverage and your initiation of sleep time. Even then, they were able to see on average, people lost 41 minutes of sleep, but it's much better than, let's say, having your last caffeinated beverage within 4 or 3 or 2 hours before your bedtime. And in terms of, let's say, the amount of caffeine that one is going to take, for most healthy adults, 400 milligrams of caffeine might be acceptable. That translates to 4 cups of coffee, and you can split that up as you will. But you're going to want to bias your caffeine intake close to your wake time, at least in the morning or late morning, and give yourself that 6-hour leeway between when you want to go to sleep. You also spoke about people who are sensitive to effects of caffeine. And, theoretically speaking, they might be people who have, they're slow metabolizers of caffeine. If you're a slow metabolizer, yes, you should probably give yourself that 12-hour window. And you'll know this, growing up, you'll be the person that has, the small tremor when you drink coffee, you get too amped up. It's just uncomfortable. So the timing is key there.
All right. What about when to drink coffee in the morning? So I've also read that you need to let your body wake up for a certain amount of time, an hour and a half, and then drink coffee in order to optimize your ability to concentrate. So, if I try and do work the second I wake up, I'm still kind of all hazy and I can't really get any work done. But if I wait for an hour and a half after I actually wake up to then take the coffee, after that coffee, I am ready to work. Is there literature to back that up?
It does make sense to delay, when you take your first cup of coffee. If you drank your cup of coffee the moment you woke up in the morning, it might not be productive at all because it's, like I mentioned, it works by one part of its mode of action is to displace adenosine. And if you are a person that's just woken up, there's barely any adenosine buildup, in which case, that side of alertness promotion is, it's just not there. The other thing is that if we're looking for, let's say, performance enhancement and, even in Olympics, there's cutoffs. There's maximal cutoffs for caffeine in one's blood and urine, above which you're doping. So absorption of caffeine, and let's say it's maximal serum levels, I think, they crest around 45 minutes of taking it. You're going to want to time, that onset of action with whatever you're doing, right? If you take it too early, you've had your highest alertness and response time at a time where you didn't need it. So I think it makes sense not to drink it right away, but, time it Everyone's different. Time it so that that's the perfect timing for you to drink your cup of coffee, but also get going through your day.
Let's move on to another liquid, and that is alcohol. The newest guidelines suggest that we shouldn't drink any alcohol, but that's kind of a bit extreme for most of us. I like to crack a cold beer at the dock at the cottage or have a fine Bordeaux with dinner sometimes. When should we stop drinking alcohol before bedtime?
The general rule that we tell people in terms of, the last end time for alcohol use, we do tell people to avoid it, like let's say 3 to 4 hours before your bedtime. Alcohol increases GABA activity in the brain, which is the main inhibitory drive of our brain, balancing out the excitatory side that's glutamate based. So I think we've all had the experience, if we have like a beer or a glass of wine with dinner, we might be able to fall asleep quicker from that increased GABA activity. The problem is when our liver breaks down and metabolizes the alcohol, we have the rebound effect. So it interrupts sleep by causing more middle of night awakenings. I think a 3 to 4 hour window before you go to sleep, that's going to be the minimum acceptable window. And then, again, depending on what kind of alcohol you're taking in, the time to metabolize will also be different. And that's the problem with alcohol. It's very unpredictable, like as compared to, other medications that we prescribe that, let's say, mediate GABA activity, then that's more a predictable thing.
All right. So the old nightcap before you go to sleep of a little shot of rye or something is not a good thing for your sleep.
No, you will never hear anybody say that that's okay.
Okay. Kind of similar to alcohol is cannabis. I guess there's cannabis and then there's just the CBD part of cannabis, which is legal in Canada and a few of the states in the US as well. What does the evidence suggest when it comes to using cannabis or CBD before sleep?
Yeah, a lot of work has gone into investigating the utility of cannabinoids for the purposes of initiating sleep and sustaining sleep. Basically, a lot of companies, a lot of chemists want to use cannabinoids as a treatment for insomnia and sleep disturbance. So I can tell you that all sorts of different combinations of cannabinoids have been trialed in RCTs for insomnia, whether it's some sort of mix of THC, which is a psychoactive compound which causes people to feel high when they take it, or cannabidiol, CBD, as you mentioned, and then CBN, cannabinol. So people have tried lots of different mixes and levels of these cannabinoids. And what I can tell you is that they might be able to show positive evidence for reduced sleep latency if it's a short-term trial, let's say 4 to 6 weeks. It can reduce the time it takes for a person to fall asleep, which is sleep latency. But anytime you extend these trials for a longer period, they actually have the opposite effect. They tend to, if the person's taking them on a nightly basis, it takes them longer to fall asleep. And they have more interruptions in the middle of the night. And when you look at the sleep architecture as measured by sleep EEG in sleep studies, polysomnography, what you're going to see is a propensity for more light sleep, a substantial reduction in deep sleep and dream sleep, and it's counterproductive. So you add to that the risk of psychosis, even in people with no genetic propensity for psychosis. In people that take cannabinoids, it's a no-go. So in the latest Delphi consensus treatment suggestions in the Canadian group of which I'm part, we say that cannabinoids can only be considered for a very narrow segment of sleep disturbance. It would be for people that have sleep issues in the context of chronic pain with or without cancer. Outside of that, it's a no-go.
Interesting. So daily pot smoking is a bad idea for sleep.
It's a bad idea. And, like we know people that smoke pot on a nightly basis, and the versions of themselves that are abstinent, I think generally are the better versions.
All right. So very narrow therapeutic indications for CBD, if you look at the evidence, and other cannabinoids as well. Let's take a little break to hear from one of our sponsors, Metricade, the experts in complex physician scheduling since 2012. Metricade's expert schedulers are their secret sauce. These people truly understand the complexities of physician scheduling. They empower us by providing the tools we need to manage our teams efficiently. At the same time, they give physicians more freedom to share their workflow preferences, so schedules aren't just fair, they're actually workable. Metricade's system is built to make your schedule work for you. They take the stress out of shift planning so that you can focus on what matters most. Go to metricade.com/emcases to learn more about how smarter scheduling can work for you. That's metricaid, one word, .com/EMCASES. We've talked about substances, things to eat or drink or smoke or take prior to falling asleep. I want to talk about light and dark, which, as we mentioned, are sort of the triggers for our circadian rhythms. First, can you tell us a bit about what our brains are actually doing when it comes to light and dark affecting our circadian rhythm?
Yeah, so I mentioned that there's the melanopsin receptors of our eyes are independent of cone rods and cones in the retina. So they receive stimuli by way of light, and the default setting is that if there's light stimuli, then there's an outward inhibitory signal to the suprachiasmatic nuclei, which is the center for internal body clock. It's the center for the circadian rhythm, and it has an inhibitory effect on the secretion of melatonin from the pineal gland. So when your melanopsin receptors that detect a relative decrease in light exposure, i.e. sundown, or historically traditional sundown, then we lose that inhibitory signal to the pineal gland. And then that's when melatonin is being secreted. The secretion of melatonin is what controls, when we start to feel sleepy and when we want to wake.
All right, so that's a little bit about how it works in the brain. What about the different kinds of light? Like there's the spectrum of light, which is measured in kelvins. Like a candle light is 1,000 kelvins, whereas daylight is about 4,500 kelvins. How does that spectrum of light, on one end of the spectrum, it's yellow, and on the other end of the spectrum, it's cold or blue. How does that affect our sleep, and what do we need to know about that in terms of going to sleep and waking up?
Yeah, the wavelengths of light, which dictate the nature of it. So let's say you mentioned, warm lighting, which is what we prefer indoors. They tend to be yellower. If you go to Home Depot or some sort of hardware store, you'll have the ability to choose between cold lights and warm lights. So warm lights are the ones that are more desirable for indoor lighting. At hospitals or places where they want us to work, we see more cold lighting that's more biased towards a blue tinge. So light, as I mentioned, is the strongest sign giver for internal body clock. It's what allows us to manipulate our internal body clock, whether in the context of, mitigating problems with shift work or jet lag. So it's like this. Warmer lights have less sleep disturbance effects if we're exposed to it close to our bedtime as compared to the very cold blue lighting. The cold blue lighting will have a greater effect on the suprachiasmatic nuclei and delay the onset of melatonin secretion as compared to, let's say, exposure to the same brightness of light, but relatively lower in kelvins. So, you mentioned candles, which are very, very low in Kelvin rating. And then on the far right, on the opposite end, we're going to have like that blue high Kelvin rating light. So, if you're picking between poison, right, then the ones that are low Kelvin, the more warmer lights they're less inclined to screw up your nighttime sleep.
Okay, so if you're going to have a bedside lamp, you want it low Kelvin, like 1,000 Kelvin. And then in the morning, conversely, we'll talk a little bit about light therapy and that sort of thing to wake you up in the morning. But in the morning, you'll want more of the blue light.
That's right. The blue lighting in the morning helps nighttime sleep. It's also been demonstrated to improve one's mood. And you'll know that we prescribe those types of lights, those very blue wavelength lights with minimum brightness 10,000 lux in the morning as a treatment for seasonal depression.
Yeah, let's talk about that a little bit more. So let's say our listeners don't have seasonal affective disorder. Is there value if you live in a climate where it's cloudy and there's not much sunlight out and you're not going outside the first thing in the day? Is there value just for people who don't have problems with sleep? Is there value in exposing yourself to bright blue light in the morning?
In the absence of pathology, exposing yourself to that kind of light in the morning is not going to hurt you. And if you're a relatively younger person, let's say you're like a teenager up to the age of 24, these people have a tendency to sleep late and wake up late by sheer force of genetics. We've all had that. We all go through that process. And then after like, let's say age 24, we all have physiologic phase advance. The older we get, year by year, we sleep a little bit earlier and wake up a little bit earlier, such that you see a huge contrast between teenagers and, grandparents who you must have heard stories or know somebody like that, an older person that sleeps at 8 p.m. and awakens very, very early in the morning, and they're very bored in the morning because there's no one to talk to. So when you expose yourself to bright light in the morning, it's one method to shift your sleepiness and your internal body clock earlier. And if you do so on a regular basis, at the same time in the morning when you wake up, it only stabilizes your internal body clock, and that's going to buttress your mood, reduce your risk of depression. So it can't hurt you, and it might help you.
So if you expose yourself to light in the morning, you'll get sleepier earlier in the evening?
Yes. Exposure to the blue light of minimum 10,000 lux brightness in the morning will shift their sleepiness and wake time earlier. But if you do so on a regular basis, like let's say every single night for, months on end, it's not going to perpetually shift your internal body clock earlier. It'll just do so up to a certain point, after which it's going to remain stable.
Okay. And it might put you in a better mood for the day.
Absolutely.
All right.
You mentioned, light, light exposure as influenced by geography and cloud cover. If you are from an equatorial country, that is less of an issue. If you're from a country that's far north of the equator or far south of the equator, there will be periods of time in your winter time where unfortunately, the sun's going to be behind some sort of gloomy cover, in which case you can preemptively have this light exposure in the morning as a means to reduce any negative impacts during nighttime sleep due to cloud cover and lack of light exposure in the morning.
Got it. We'll talk more about light therapy when it comes to shift work, but that's good to know that light therapy might have benefits even if you don't have problems with sleep. Let's talk about light and darkness when you're getting ready for sleep and when you actually go to sleep. So we already talked about how we want to have less bright lights before we go to sleep, and we want more yellow or lower Kelvin lights before we go to sleep. Then my understanding is that when you are asleep, that you want it as dark as possible. And then we'll get to this when we get to the shift work as well, is that, if we're working a night shift and we have to sleep during the day, it's going to be key to make the room as dark as possible. Or what's your recommendation in general about light and dark just before sleep and during sleep?
You're going to want to avoid light that's high brightness and lights that tend to be more cold or blue, as you mentioned, in terms of higher numbers in kelvins. If you expose yourself to that kind of light, you'll actually delay the onset of your melatonin, right? Which regulates the timing of your sleep and sleepiness and when you want to wake, etc. Because then that light is it becomes a substitute for what your melanopsin receptors, your eyes, thinks is sunlight. So if it receives that kind of light, your brain's thinking, well, it's daytime, so I need to stay alert. So close to bedtime, we would say 3 to 4 hours before your intended bedtime, you're going to want to avoid that kind of light. If you have to have light, have it as the lower Kelvin, more warm yellowish light. And it's just best practice if you want the perfect sleep, just to not have lights on, as you go to bed, and certainly no lighting once you've initiated and fallen asleep. Again, work done by they're the world leaders in circadian research, work done at Harvard, but also Northwestern University in Chicago. They've found that even if your eyelids are closed, that not closing your blinds delivers sufficient lighting that penetrates your eyelids, that it screws up the quality of your sleep at night and will shorten your sleep duration, increase arousals from sleep. You get more awakenings from sleep. So keeping your sleeping quarters cool, dark, and quiet, one of the best suggestions.
Okay. In terms of keeping it dark, I guess there's all kinds of window dressings you can put to try and block it out. I myself have been using a Manta, I think it's called, a Manta Eye Shield, which are very comfortable. I've been using for years, and they're really good at blocking out the light. I don't receive any money from Manta. What do you usually suggest to your patients and clients in terms of making it as dark as possible for sleep?
Whatever works is great, right? Some people are going to be more comfortable, or their homes may already have blackout blinds installed. And then sometimes that's not necessarily some part of your environment that you can change, right? Depending on, where your sleep domicile is. In that instance, other patients they'll wear eye shields, right? Just things that you wear over your eyes with some sort of elastic in the back. And as long as you're not receiving any light stimuli, you're good.
Okay, great. Very closely related to light are screens. And many of us, I'm sure, are guilty of looking at our phones or our iPads or our computers right until just before we go to sleep. And my understanding is that there is a significant amount of blue light that's emitted from computer screens. What's the recommendation in terms of screen use and in terms of when to stop using them? I understand that there's apps you can put on your computer. I use one called iFlux that at 8 p.m. it just takes away all that blue light and it turns it into sort of yellower light. And then sometimes I'll decrease the brightness as well on my computer if I need to do work within 2 or 3 hours before I go to sleep. What's the recommendation in terms of screens before sleep?
Yeah, I think doing what you've spoken of, like in your own experience, I think that's going to be fine for, let's say, a person that doesn't have a sensitivity to like sleep issues. If we're talking about a person that's working and doesn't have insomnia disorder, doesn't have any other sleep disorder that's going to make it hard for them to sleep at night, I think what you talked about is totally acceptable. If we're talking about a person who's very, very sensitive to sleep disturbance, a person that's had multiple episodes of insomnia disorder throughout their lifetime, I would say if you're really interested in having perfect sleep, then for the 3 to 4 hours before your intended bedtime, then you just avoid light exposure in general. And that's going to include your smartphone, any sort of, tablets, television, any form of artificial lighting. That's the recipe for people who have a sensitivity to sleep issues.
Okay. And for those of us who do like to read before sleep and it actually helps us relax, I understand that, again, I have no money in Amazon or Kindle, but I understand that Kindle does not emit blue light, whereas, say, an iPad does.
I wish I knew more about like the different e-readers and, the specifications, like let's say for like tablets, but anything that is less bright is probably, better compared to whatever you use that has greater lighting. I'm thinking just in personal experience, if I'm using an iPad, like they do get pretty bright, which is great during the daytime if you're using it outside. In contrast, if you're dealing with like, those e-ink readers and even the ones that are backlit are just not very bright at all, using those compared to like, the very bright LCD or LED screens, that's going to be better for your sleep health.
Okay. So, I'm just trying to think about the people who like to read before sleep. If you're going to use a bedside lamp, make sure it's not very bright and that it has low kelvins, so it's more of a yellow light. If you prefer paper books, if you prefer a screen, get an e-reader that emits as little light as possible and as little blue light as possible. And my understanding is that a Kindle is a good choice in that regard. Just a quick word from one of our sponsors, the Rural Ultrasound Fellowship. Hey, POCUS fans, ever consider an ultrasound fellowship? In just 1 year, go from solid POCUS user to full-on expert. No career pause and no travel required. The RUF's world-class faculty has trained over 40 ER docs and rural GPs from around the globe. Fully online, fully flexible, with a 97% completion rate, it really works. Re-energize your practice. Boost your confidence. Visit ruralultrasound.com to learn more. That's RURAL ultrasound.com. I want to talk a little bit more about sleep environment, and you had mentioned this, but there's noise and temperature. I use earplugs for sleep, especially if I'm sleeping during the day when other people in my household are up. I use earplugs to try and block out the noise. And then in terms of temperature, my understanding is that you want to sleep at a lower temperature than normal room temperature. What do you recommend in terms of noise and temperature and how we should manage that?
Yeah, regarding noise, you want to keep that to absolute minimum. Noise is one reason why people have to wake up, right? And that's rooted in survival. So it's part of our evolutionary means to live as long as possible, as healthy as possible, right? Like a person must wake up to noise. A person must wake up to urinary urgency in most cases if the person is healthy and or pain. So you're going to want to keep noise and sounds to a minimum. And you've mentioned earplugs as one strategy to do so. Some people find it easier to fall asleep with a white noise machine. Now, is that the majority of people in the world? Probably not. They're probably a minority. But if it works for you that you sleep or able to fall asleep quicker and sustain sleep for longer with the presence of a white noise machine, so be it. But I think for most people, they do sleep better with no white noise machine or anything that creates sounds. About temperature, this has been widely studied. There are optimal temperatures for sleep, and they bias against and away from high temperatures. So cool, dark, and quiet being the optimal sleep environment. People say 20 degrees Celsius is a great temperature to initiate and sustain sleep. If you get too cold, you'll be aroused from sleep. If it's too hot, you simply won't be able to fall asleep. It's not on the subject of what we're talking about today, but it's a concern for us that study sleep medicine that climate change and increasing temperatures around the world might precipitate insomnia and other sleep disturbances.
Interesting. So you want your room to be below 20 degrees.
20 is good.
When you fall asleep, and then during your sleep, you want it to be also below 20 degrees. What about for waking up?
I don't think we need to change temperatures throughout the night. I think around 20 degrees is optimal. When you are in dream sleep, you enter a poikilothermic state. So you actually don't, in dream sleep, in REM sleep, your body doesn't regulate its temperature like it does in non-REM sleep. So in the morning, people actually feel quite cold when they wake up, unless you have sleep apnea, in which case it's a totally different story. I mean, in REM sleep, people get a lot of sleep apnea. And then if you stop breathing, then your fight or flight hormones are activated. So you might actually wake up with, some sweat and feeling kind of warm, but that's a pathological condition. Most of us wake up feeling, kind of cold.
Okay. So 20 degrees is a good sleep temperature, but you don't want it to be too cold because then you'll have difficulty falling asleep. Okay, great. And just for our US listeners out there who are still using Fahrenheit, 20 degrees Celsius, I believe, is 68 degrees Fahrenheit. All right. What about alarm clocks? We had mentioned near the top that ideally we want to wake up the same time every morning, and you're going to be doing that with an alarm clock. I've also heard people say that, well, you don't want an alarm clock that's too bright because that's emitting light and you don't want light when you're sleeping. I understand iPhones now on a charger can be off until you turn your head and look at them, and then they'll turn on. I've heard arguments that you should never check the time at night because that might just make you anxious and more likely not to fall asleep again. What's your take on alarm clocks and iPhones and checking times?
Yeah. So first off, whether it's a phone or like an alarm clock in your sleep domicile, you probably don't want to have the ability to check the time. Checking the time inherently ruins a person's sleep because everyone does the same thing. You'll look at the time and you're going to do some math. You're going to figure out how much time do I have left before I have to wake up for the fun time. And that act in itself is not conducive to sleep. It's conducive to insomnia. So hence we ask people to set an alarm for their consistent daily wake time, after which you don't check the clock. Even if you wake up in the middle of the night, you have to use the bathroom. Hopefully you're able to do so without turning on a light. And then you're going to go back not knowing what time it is. Because let's pretend it's like this. You woke up at 5:30 and your alarm time is 6. At 5:30, if you have blackout blinds, you might not even know that it's only half an hour to your wake time, in which case you can use your bathroom, go back, and you can squeeze out the maximum amount of sleep that you can. And you wouldn't be able to do that if you checked.
It's a good example. You had mentioned waking up in the middle of the night. What should we do if we do wake up in the middle of the night? I've heard things like counting sheep, which doesn't really work. I've heard things like, well, if you really can't fall asleep, you should actually go into another room and do something different that's relaxing for 10, 15 minutes and then come back. What's your recommendation for people who wake up in the middle of the night and are having trouble getting back to sleep?
Yeah, we actually have a very evidence-based intervention for that kind of, specifically for this kind of situation. It's part and parcel of the gold standard treatment for insomnia disorder, which is a cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia. So in this particular type of therapy, there's a principle called stimulus control, where they tell you what to do exactly in a situation. If you wake up in the middle of the night and it feels like it's been a long time, again, right, we're not checking. It just feels like it's been a long time and you still can't go back to sleep. It's best that you leave your bedroom, go to a different room that's dimly lit, and do something boring until you feel that head nodding feeling again. And then that's your cue to go back to your bedroom. When I say do something boring in that dimly lit room, generally speaking, we tell people to do something like a word search. As you know, those are like, the sheets of paper, and there's like, a grid of letters, and there's jumbled up words that you can, search and look for, and you're going to circle them, whether it's horizontally or vertically or diagonally. The reason why we ask people to do that is all the questions are on the page. So you're not going to get riled up like you would if you did a crossword puzzle and you invariably find a hint that you can't solve. You can't do math. Math is universally annoying, at least annoying to the point where it causes more mental activity. So you don't want to do Sudoku. So we tell people, do a word search in a dimly lit room that's not your bedroom, and then go back when you're feeling sleepy. So you're breaking the association between wakefulness and your bed. And that's the psychological concept of conditioning. And we know that sleep is subjective conditioning. If you're wide awake and you're trying to fall back asleep and you stay in your room all the time, night to night, after a while, your brain thinks it's normal to do that. So this breaks that cycle and also allows you to feel and become more sensitive to the signs and feelings of sleepiness, that head nodding feeling. And as you become more sensitive to those signs, you're better able to have better sleep.
Fantastic. All right. So just to kind of summarize the basic sleep hygiene stuff, before sleep, no screens for a couple of hours before sleep, if you can help it. No alcohol for 3 hours before sleep. No big meals for 3 hours before sleep. During sleep, you want to keep the temperature in your bedroom 20 degrees or even a little less. Use earplugs to block out any noise or a white noise machine if the earplugs don't work for you. Keep your room dark or wear eye shield during sleep. And when you wake up, you want to wake up to nice bright light, blue daylight. And if you don't have any blue daylight, then you might want to try an artificial light source. All right, let's move on to shift work sleep strategies in particular, now that we know a bit about sleep hygiene. Let's start with scheduling strategies. Now, different emergency department groups will have different needs. Some groups, like the one I work in, is huge with about 65 docs on the schedule. Others are tiny, and there's everything in between. But I want to talk about sleep-friendly scheduling for shift workers. So first, let's talk about casino shifts. That's where instead of a shift that goes from midnight to 8 a.m., there's two shifts, one that might start at, say, 10 p.m. and goes till 4 a.m. so that doc can get to sleep before the sun rises. And then the second doc comes on at 4 a.m. and goes until, say, 10 or 11 a.m. And they're called casino shifts because they were invented by the casinos so that their dealers would be alert in the middle of the night. Why are casino shifts considered better than traditional night shifts when it comes to sleep health?
Yeah, traditional shifts prevent a person from being able to achieve some sort of sleep when it's dark out. When you do casino shifts, by definition, there's at least a couple of hours that the person can sleep when it's still dark out, whether it's after the shift or just before the shift. So having that ability to sleep when it's dark out, which is what humans are intended to do, that's how we're built, genetically speaking. We want to be tired and sleepy when it's dark out and to be alert when it's light out. And these casino shifts allow people that work them to do that.
Okay, yeah. They talk about how it protects your anchor sleep. Can you elaborate on what that means?
Yeah. Anchor sleep is basically the period of sleep when people that have to do shift work are able to sleep when it's dark out. So that generally speaking, the anchor period would be something like 1 a.m. to 6 a.m., depending on where you live in the world. In that period, it's going to be dark out, and it's going to be a time when your internal body clock, your circadian phase, is at a low. So, even if you're working in that period, your natural human propensity is to be at rest and to be sleepy, and your reaction time's going to be longer. You're going to have worse vigilance. You're going to have worse attention. So the anchor sleep is basically just those periods that people, if they're doing casino shifts, that they're able to carve out some sleep when it's dark out.
Got it. Okay. So the first scheduling strategy we can use is casino shifts rather than overnight shifts. The next strategy I want to talk about that I've heard about is called advance forward scheduling. So that's when the start time of your next shift is later than today's shift. So for example, if today you have a 4 p.m. shift, then tomorrow it's better for your sleep if you do a 6 p.m. or an 8 p.m. shift than it would be if you did, say, a noon or a 2 p.m. shift. Can you explain to us just what the thinking behind advanced forward scheduling is?
Yeah, I'll put it to you this way. We've all had the experience of traveling west. And when we travel west, when we get there, we, adjust our time, our watch or our phone, whatever it is, to the local time. You end up having to force yourself to stay awake later to adjust to the local time. That's infinitely easier than forcing yourself to sleep earlier, which is what we see with eastward travel. And this advanced type of scheduling means that if you're shifting people from, let's say, working, and I'm just pretending here, okay, like 8 o'clock in the morning, and then they finish at 8 p.m. at night, it makes sense, and it's easier for people to shift their internal body clocks if the next set of shifts that they have to do means that they have to stay up later and wake up later, in any sort of increments of hours that are demanded. Staying up later is easier. Forcing yourself to sleep earlier is infinitely more difficult. And that's the idea behind this.
Great. Yeah, that's a great analogy with the flying east or flying west. If you're lucky enough to have a large enough group you work with, like I do, there's usually half the docs that consider themselves night owls. They like the night and the evening shifts. And then the other half consider themselves early birds who like early morning shifts. And if you have a big group and they're split evenly, that's ideal for your scheduling. Why is it important to identify yourself and everyone in your group or your team as a night owl or an early bird for optimal shift scheduling?
That would be the game theory optimal situation where you have a 50-50 distribution and then people are happy with, choosing their own types of shifts based on their circadian preferences. Most people in the world are morningness oriented. So they're morning larks. A smaller minority are going to be night owls, but allowing yourself to take the shifts that most well align with your internal body clock means you're minimizing health concerns. The whole idea behind, the health problems as it, due to shift work is purely from the mismatch of the light-dark cycle of the external environment, the times when you're forced to work, and your own internal body clock. If you have a person whose tendency, like they work best, they're most alert and strong when it's dark out, and in fact, they feel the most sleepy in terms of timing when it's light out, those folks are best equipped to do night shifts. And allowing that sort of self-selection minimizes the mismatch that any particular person has in terms of their own internal body clock and what's required of them.
So far we've talked about casino shifts versus night shifts. We talked about the night owls, dividing up the night owls and the morning larks or the early birds. What about recovery time after a shift or after a night shift? What's sort of the ideal recovery time? I work with physicians who will do like back-to-back shifts, overnight, and then they'll be working a few hours later, another shift, which if I did, I would probably be killing patients in the emergency department. I would not be performing well. What is the ideal recovery time?
Yeah, the great thing is that we have the evidence. It's been tested, and it's actually it's the number of hours minimum is cited in a recent paper done by our colleague Sarah Gray, and you need to have at least 11 hours between shifts to fully recover. Like that's the ideal situation.
Okay, great. Easy number to remember, 11. It goes to 11. All right. For any emergency department group, there's a certain number of night shifts that need to be covered, or casino shifts if you do them that way. And some docs seem to like doing many night shifts or casino shifts in a row. And then other docs like to spread them out. If let's say you're doing 3 or 4 a month, some people like to just spread them out like once a week. And then other people like to do them in a row. What is generally better from a sleep hygiene point of view?
So this has also been studied to a great degree. So every time you have to do a shift, like where you're shifting from, let's say, staying awake when it's light out and being alert when it's light out and working when it's light out and sleeping when it's dark out, and you go from that and you go the opposite way, you will always have an acute phase you can't overcome where your cognition is impaired to some degree, not fully impaired, but to some degree. Your alertness will be impaired to some degree. Your attention span will be compromised to some degree. And that acute phase is you simply can't mitigate that. There is an adaptation though on the second night and on the third night. You have to balance that adaptation with what is the progressive accumulation of sleep debt and negative effects from that. So if you force a person to work when it's dark out and sleep when it's light out, there's no person in the world that's able to attain the same sleep duration and sleep quality as they would if they just matched up with their natural internal body clock setup. So the magic seems to be doing like your night shifts or your opposite shifts to your internal body clock in a group, but not more than, let's say, 2 or 3 nights in a row. Because after that, then the progressive accumulation of sleep debt and the negative effects from that overcome your adaptation to the opposite in your internal body clock at work.
So if you need to do 3 night shifts or casino shifts or whatever is opposite to your usual sleep, it's better to do 2 or 3 in a row, get them over with, rather than spread them out through the month.
Yep.
And now a word from one of our sponsors, Echo Health. If you've ever guessed what you heard through a stethoscope, you're not alone. Detecting a new aortic regurg murmur to help you pick up that acute aortic dissection with a regular stethoscope can be really hard in the noisy ED environment. Thank goodness for Echo Health. Echo combines the stethoscope you already know with enhanced audio and advanced AI to help you detect heart and lung conditions earlier and with more confidence. Echo's digital stethoscope amplifies heart and lung sounds up to 40 times, and noise cancellation cuts out distractions. Unlock murmur and AFib detection powered by Echo AI, along with sound recording, sharing, and more for earlier diagnoses and seamless collaboration. Backed by 4 million heart sounds and 8 FDA clearances for devices and AI algorithms, those who use Echo are 2 times more likely to detect heart disease. If you want to give your patients the highest quality care, I encourage you to join 600,000 healthcare professionals already using Echo. I trust Echo so much that I worked with their team to create a special offer just for our listeners. Right now, you can get $50 off plus a free customizable chest piece cover at echohealth.com/EMC. Your purchase is HSA and FSA eligible and may qualify for CME reimbursement. Plus, Echo guarantees you'll detect heart and lung conditions more confidently. If you don't, return it for a full refund. Go to echohealth.com/EMC for $50 off plus a free chest piece cover. That's ekohealth.com/EMC. I want to talk a little bit about minimizing fatigue during shifts. So, sometimes despite our best intentions, we're sleep deprived, partly because of our shift work. There might be other reasons, and that we're very fatigued during a shift. The duration of our shifts should ideally be 7 or 8 hours, is my understanding, and that some emergency physicians need to do 12-hour shifts, which is probably not ideal. But I find after about 6 hours, I'm pretty fatigued no matter how well I've slept. How do you suggest mitigating fatigue during a shift?
Yeah, there's a couple of ways to deal with this. So let's talk about things that you can do before your shift. So before a night shift, some people will just pre-bank sleep. So sleeping just before, like, let's say a night shift. And if you do so for, anywhere between, let's say, 20 minutes to an hour, that might reduce your lack of attention, your poor reaction time, all those negative things that happen from working a night shift. And pre-banking sleep doesn't seem to affect your ability to sleep later on when you're done your shift, when you go back home in the morning. So that's one thing that you can do before your shift.
So just with the pre-banking and the napping before your shift, my understanding is that based on the typical sleep cycle, and I find this, that if I have a nap for 10, 15, 20 minutes, I feel totally refreshed and rejuvenated. If I have an hour and a half nap, I feel totally refreshed and rejuvenated. But if I sleep for about 40 minutes or so, and then for whatever reason wake up, I feel like I haven't slept in 24 hours. I feel terrible. It's really hard to get ready for a shift based on that. And my understanding is that's because of the usual sleep cycle that we go through, the different stages of sleep. What are the best sort of napping strategies?
Yeah. Napping strategies, but also in the context of pre-banking your sleep, it's exactly what you mentioned. So keeping your naps either very short and sweet, like maybe up to 20 minutes in length, or having them longer so that you avoid waking up from deep sleep. So when we think about sleep architecture, there's wake, there's N1 light sleep, N2 light sleep, N3 deep sleep, or slow wave sleep, or delta sleep. That's what we see in a sleep EEG. There's a propensity of delta waves, which are high amplitude, low frequency. So your brain is actually the most relaxed in that stage of sleep. It's also the time when your body releases growth hormone. And we'd like to think that that's when your lymphatic system is most active. It's shuttling away the waste products from your brain. Hilariously, when you go into dream sleep, the brain waves look like the person's awake because your brain and your mind is, creating situations and characters and feelings such that we see high frequency, low amplitude brain waves that are similar to the person that's awake. So to wake up from deep sleep when the brain waves are so slow, it doesn't happen right away. It's not an instantaneous process. So that's why people feel drunk if they sleep the wrong period of time in a nap. So, to summarize, either short and sweet, 20 minutes, or like you said, 90 minutes. 90 minutes is like the typical length of one sleep cycle. It's just that it's probably harder to make yourself sleep 90 minutes compared to 20 minutes, right? Like in that context, when you're doing your 20-minute nap, you're probably doing so by setting an alarm. You might not be able to sleep 90 minutes. You might, just inherently wake up earlier than that if you're pre-banking for a shift. So that's why most people should just do the 20 minutes.
That's napping and pre-banking. So what I do is I try and do a 15-minute or so nap. If I'm really, really tired, I might try and do that 90-minute nap. After I wake up from the nap, ideally, I can do some cardiovascular exercise for half an hour. And then I have my caffeine a half hour before I start my shift. And then it peaks right when I hit my shift. And that's kind of my routine.
During the first half of your shift, there's nothing wrong with exposing yourself to that very cold blue light, right? That's like a way to manipulate your internal body clock so that you get more alertness, even though it's really dark out and everything in your brain and body tells you that you should be sleepy. So you trick yourself into thinking it's daytime by exposing yourself to that blue, high Kelvin type of light during the first half of your shift. I mean, that's been shown to increase alertness and reaction time in policemen and nursing staff without necessarily affecting one's ability to sleep thereafter when you finish.
Oh, great idea. I could even bring my 10,000 lux light emitting screen to work. And if at my computer station at work, I could have that going for the first couple of hours. Anything else you can suggest in terms of mitigating fatigue during a shift?
Yeah. What we referred to very early on, which is this strategic use of caffeine. Drinking coffee at the beginning of your shift is going to be fine. There's nothing wrong with that to buttress your alertness and your cognition, really, your reaction time. All those things are improved with caffeine use when you're working overnight shifts. Just don't do it too close to the time when you have to leave your shift. So I would, keep your caffeine intake restricted to like the first quarter or half of your shift, after which you're not going to do that anymore. And by the way, to facilitate good sleep as you leave your overnight shift, maybe during the second half of your shift, wear blue blocking sunglasses. They tend to have lenses that are yellow. They block blue wavelength light. Keep them on. Wear them, as you drive home, and then only take them off once you've gone into bed and turn off your lights. And in that way, you preserve your ability to secrete melatonin as you go back home to induce sleep.
Great idea. So as you're cleaning up at the end of your shift, you can put on your blue light blocking glasses, which don't look like sunglasses. They actually look just like normal glasses pretty much. So the patients won't question you.
Well, they do have a yellow lens. Like, we have right? Like I'm wearing glasses, you're wearing glasses right now. And, our optometrist will order lenses with there's a coating on it that blocks blue light. But for the purposes of, let's say, shift work and doing that, they're going to be the ones that actually have a color to the lens. They tend to be like yellowish or amber.
A bit yellow. Okay. Yeah. Not like full dark sunglasses.
No, not black. Yeah.
Okay. Great. And then, on your commute home, wearing major sunglasses or blue light blocking glasses is a great idea. Many emergency providers struggle with falling asleep after a night shift. What are some of the evidence-based strategies we can use to sort of reprogram our sleep-wake cycle or reduce sleep latency during the day, after a night shift? You had already mentioned, wearing sunglasses or blue light blocking glasses near the end of your shift and then on your commute home. Anything else we can do after the shift to get us asleep?
Yeah, during the last quarter of your shift, you might choose to pop some exogenous melatonin, over-the-counter melatonin, as you've been wearing your blue blocking sunglasses. The exogenous melatonin that you take can also lead to a sleep-inducing effect. Not necessarily making you feel sleepier. It's not necessarily soporific at normal dosing, but you will be able to shift your sleepiness earlier. So in conjunction with blocking your natural secretion, in addition to blocking the light that would have, screwed up your natural secretion of melatonin, taking exogenous over-the-counter melatonin during the last quarter of your shift might help you sleep earlier and for longer when you get home.
Great tip. Yeah, I want to talk a little bit more about melatonin. So melatonin basically kickstarts your circadian rhythm. And my understanding is that there's a couple of problems with melatonin. One is that because it's over the counter, you don't know what dose you're actually getting. And then it seems to be confusing as to what dose you should take and then the timing of that dose. And you just alluded to taking in the last quarter of your shift. What's the ideal dose and where should we be getting the melatonin? Because the dosing is all over the place. And at what time before we want to go to sleep should we be taking the melatonin?
The dosing of the melatonin, what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to mimic, right? Like the trials and experiments that people have done in circadian rhythm research. So in the context of shift work and treating that, the dose is anywhere between 0.3 milligrams to 5 milligrams, usually timed in terms of absolute time. So it's a simplification of, the true timing of the optimal timing of when we would administer it. The optimal time of administration of exogenous melatonin has to do with the timing of your body temperature minimum, which is a little bit different than everybody. But to make it simple and usable as advice, you want to take it 4 to 5 hours before your desired bedtime. So maybe 3 hours, maybe 3 to 4 hours. So it's a little bit different for everybody, but that's the timing that you want to take it. If you want to fall asleep by 10 a.m., you might want to take it at 6.
Wow, that's a game changer because I think On most of the over-counter bottles for melatonin, they suggest taking it when you go to sleep or just before you go to sleep. So,
and you mentioned this, like, just now, right? Which is like melatonin's all over the place in North America, in Canada.
the dosing, you mean?
Yeah. For the reason, like they've studied this. There's a nice paper from Guelph University in Ontario, in Canada, from 2017. They investigated 31 different melatonin supplements that you can buy at a drugstore. What they found was that between brands, there was a huge variability in terms of what is delivered versus what is promised on the label. So it's something like minus 87% to plus 468% in terms of, the potency that's delivered. And even if we're talking about the same brand, if we're studying, brand A and we buy it in January and then we compare brand A again, but we bought it in, June, lot to lot variability was as high as 400%. So unfortunately, because it's over the counter, regulation doesn't seem to have been as good as other prescribed drugs. So really don't know what is in the pill versus what is promised.
All right. So I guess you could just try melatonin. If one brand doesn't work, you might want to try a different brand. And now a word from one of our sponsors, Easy Recess, the resuscitation assistant. Easy Recess is thrilled to announce that they are now available for institutional access. In addition to providing the app for all employees in your organization, this means access to exclusive features like printable protocols with calculated medication doses, customizable content to fit your local protocols and practices, access to Easy Recess on computers via the web-based version, and much, much more. To learn more, visit the institutional license section at easyrecess.com. And as always, you can download Easy Recess and use the promo code EMCASES, that's EMCASES, one word, to get your 2-month free trial on an individual subscription. I want to talk a little bit more about sleep aids and medications. I asked ChatGPT for a list of sleep aid options, and it spat out a very, very long list. Over-the-counter medications included diphenhydramine, doxylamine, melatonin, which we already mentioned, valerian root, magnesium, L-theanine, CBD, which we've talked about, which probably is not good for sleep in the long run. And then there's a whole long prescription medication list. There's Zolpidem, the trade name of which is Ambien. There's Zopiclone. There's Lunesta. There's Restoril. There's some of these newer ones, Dayvigo. There's Blisomra. And then there's other psychiatric medications that we've all heard of, trazodone and amitriptyline and quetiapine. There's also gabapentin and there's clonidine. There's this huge long list. Besides melatonin, which we've discussed already, is there any role for any of these supplements or medications for the person who's a shift worker, but who is otherwise normal in terms of their sleep? Like they don't actually have a sleep disorder, but is there any role for using any of these medications? I mean, I'll tell you about my bias is that any medication that's going to get you to sleep and keep you asleep is probably going to be habit forming, is probably going to cause dependence, and you're going to end up addicted to it and then have more problems than you started with. What do you recommend for the person without a sleep disorder in terms of over-the-counter and prescription sleep aids?
If a person is healthy and they don't have a sleep pathology, then my absolute answer would be you don't need to take anything, right? But let's say if a person has to do shift work and now they do shift work regularly, but as a consequence of their shift work, and there's like a temporal connection to it, that the person will have, let's say, insomnia symptoms or severe daytime fatigue and sleepiness, in which case they have shift work disorder, then medications, right, can be indicated in that condition. So you mentioned that, addiction and tolerance being, of prime concern when we prescribe sedative-hypnotic medications, and that holds true for our traditional sedative-hypnotic medications. So they would include things like benzodiazepines, and the Z drugs. And then you mentioned some like Zolpidem and Zopiclone. Zopiclone is probably the most prescribed sedative-hypnotic medication in Canada of all times. So in shift work disorder, to help a person sleep when they go home, things like Zopiclone have been used. And as long as you use it, responsibly, right? You're not taking more than what you've been prescribed. You're not mixing it with substances like alcohol or cannabis. And a person like that, there's no reason why they can't do that responsibly and healthily. We don't anticipate, we don't see the risk of addiction tolerance in people that just use it in that context. However, there are actually new set of hypnotic medications that don't carry that risk of addiction tolerance. So they include the class of medications called the dual orexin receptor antagonists. So, we see people with narcolepsy. People with narcolepsy are irresistibly sleepy. And if you do a lumbar puncture on them, in classic cases of narcolepsy, they're deficient in the neurotransmitter that is primarily responsible for daytime alertness, which is hypocretin or orexin. They're two names for the same substance. And if you block the receptor for those neurotransmitters, then people will sleep, but it doesn't do so by increasing sedation. It does so by removing wakefulness. And hence, there are ongoing studies that look at these dual orexin receptor antagonists, DORA drugs, specifically for shift work disorder, because when we conceive of shift work disorder, people who are trying to sleep during the daytime when it's light out, the precise thing that they need is a reduction of wakefulness, not an increase in sedation. So I think with time, we're going to see a lot of, good evidence whether these types of drugs are ideal for shift work disorder. They seem to have equal efficacy as legacy set of hypnotic medications. It's just the benefit of them is that they're more tolerable. They have fewer side effects. But right now, because they're relatively new, they're under patent protection. So maybe one limitation is cost. About what you mentioned a bit earlier, like over-the-counter sleep aids, like let's say, diphenhydramine, Gravol, Benadryl. We don't recommend the use of those in any circumstance, and particularly in shift work, because they come with terrible anticholinergic side effects, right? So they inherently will impair cognition, etc. So they're not useful. They're not useful in shift work disorder. They're not useful in insomnia in general. We wouldn't think that old generation benzodiazepines would be used. I think there's a role for Z drugs in the treatment of shift work disorder, but also the dual orexin receptor antagonists. So that's my recommendation.
Okay. So the Z drugs like zolpiclone, for example, or zolpidem is the other one. Those do have potential for tolerance and dependence. However, if they're just used for 1 or 2 nights a couple times a month, then that's pretty safe. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. You're probably, the typical use would be like, you work nights, it's dark out, and now it's light out, and you need something to help you sleep when it's light out. If you're just using it in that context, there's little risk of running into trouble.
Okay, great. And then there's these newer medications that have been around for about 5 years that are expensive, that we're going to be seeing more RCTs on, that likely do not have any problems with dependence, that so far seem to be pretty safe. And we'll see, I guess, with bigger, more robust studies, whether this becomes something that emergency doctors are going to reach for or not.
To investigate them in the shift work context, I think that's an important next step. And I think people are actually doing that. I think it's going to prove to, if it proves to be useful, it's another tool that we have in our toolbox.
Fantastic. All right, we've covered a ton of high-yield evidence-informed strategies to help you sleep better, perform better, and feel better on and off shift. Let's go over the key takeaways for optimizing sleep as a shift worker. So first, why sleep matters for us, for EM providers. Sleep isn't optional, it's foundational. It consolidates memory, stabilizes mood, enhances performance, and even lowers your risk of cancer, heart disease, depression, and MVCs. Messing with circadian rhythms like we do in shift work impacts everything from cognitive sharpness to longevity. Let's talk about sleep physiology basics. So the 2 main drivers of sleep are sleep homeostasis. So adenosine builds up the longer you're awake, and the circadian rhythm, which is regulated by light and your internal clock. So waking up at the same time every day, even on days off, whenever you can, is key to circadian entrainment. But this isn't true for the time that you go to bed. Go to bed when you're sleepy, not at a fixed time, because sleep pressure varies with daily activity. Then there's the core practices for just good sleep hygiene. So the duration of sleep, everyone needs about 7 hours minimum to achieve optimal health, but you may need more like 8 or 9, which is pretty much dictated by genetics. What about the timing of sleep? So avoid big meals, avoid alcohol, and avoid exercise within 3 hours of bedtime, minimum, and avoid caffeine within 6 hours, or even within 12 hours if you're a slow metabolizer of caffeine. What about sleep environment? Your sleep environment should be cool, it should be dark, and it should be quiet. The best temperature to keep your bedroom in is about 20 degrees Celsius or 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Use blackout blinds or a sleep mask, use earplugs or white noise, and avoid all bright light at night. When it comes to screens like TVs, tablets, laptops, desktops, and phones, avoid blue-emitting screens 3 to 4 hours before bed. You can try using a screen filter like F-Lux for 3 hours before sleep. If you need a bedside lamp, use a warm light bulb like 2000 Kelvin. And rather than a blue light emitting tablet for reading before bed, use an e-ink reader like a Kindle, which does not emit blue light. Build in a wind down routine and make the wind down routine consistent, boring, and relaxing. Save all the thrillers and checking your email for daytime. Okay, let's talk a little bit about caffeine strategies. So up to 400 milligrams a day of caffeine is okay. So that's about 4 standard 8-ounce cups of coffee. Aim for your last dose to be at least 6 hours before bed. And the peak of caffeine kicks in around 45 minutes. So time it strategically before the start of your shift, not the end. And when you wake up in the morning, you might want to delay drinking your coffee by a bit because it does take time for your body to sort of wake up and then use the best advantage of caffeine just at the right time to perform well. What about harnessing light to minimize circadian rhythm interruption? So bright blue light in the morning resets your circadian rhythm. It may improve your mood during the day, and then it may help to trigger your internal clock for sleepiness at night so you can fall asleep more easily. So if it's sunny outside when you wake up, go outside in the morning for 30 minutes, or if it's cloudy or it's the middle of winter, consider a 10,000 lux light therapy box or glasses for 30 minutes after you wake up. In the emergency department, you can also try a light box at your workstation for the first hour or two of your night shift. Or in your car on your commute to work, you can try using a 10,000 lux light therapy box. So we want to avoid blue light at night. So switch to warm, low Kelvin, low intensity lighting, like a candle or a soft bedside lamp, like a lamp that has a 2000 Kelvin bulb in it. That's nice and soft. You can try wearing blue light blocking glasses during the second half of your night shift and on the commute home as well, or dark sunglasses if you're driving home in the blistering sun. Consider taking 0.3 to 5 milligrams of melatonin during your night shift or about 3 to 4 hours before your desired sleep time. What happens if you wake up in the middle of the night because your circadian rhythm has been off and you can't fall asleep? Don't just lie in bed for too long. If you can't just turn over and fall back asleep easily, you should get up, get out of the room, go to a room that has dim, soft, warm light, and do something boring and non-stimulating like a word search. Then return to bed only when you feel truly sleepy. Let's talk a little bit about napping. So napping can really rejuvenate you if it's done right. Pre-banking sleep before night shifts is a really good strategy for many of us. But you need to know that you should either do a 20-minute power nap, that's probably the best and safest way to do it, or if you think you can pull it off, a 90-minute full cycle nap. And that will really rejuvenate you. What you want to avoid is having a nap that's 40 or 50 minutes. And the problem there is that you wake up during deep sleep, and that'll make you even more groggy. Let's talk a little bit about scheduling. So casino shifts protect your anchor sleep. And that's that precious sleep 1 to 6 a.m. sleep window. So casino shifts are definitely preferred over the full night shift where you start work at night and then you go home during the day. Ideally, you want to break it up into casino shifts if you can. Advanced forward scheduling is better for your circadian rhythm. It's easier to stay up later than to sleep earlier. Night owls should do night shifts. Early birds should do day shifts so that you're matching people's internal clocks whenever possible. Recovery time matters. Aim for at least 11 hours between shifts. If you have to do night shifts, it's better to group them into 2 or 3 in a row rather than spreading them out to benefit from circadian adaptation while avoiding excessive sleep debt. Finally, if you have any red flags for a serious sleep disorder like obstructive sleep apnea, narcolepsy, severe insomnia, sleepwalking, or sleep terrors, please do seek expert medical attention. This podcast assumes that you don't have a serious sleep disorder. After I recorded this interview with Mike Mack, my wife suggested an app called Time Shifter for shift work that I think is worth trying out. And to be clear, I do not get any money from Timeshifter. So Timeshifter is an app originally designed for astronauts and elite athletes to beat jet lag, but it's useful for shift workers as well. You plug in your shift schedule, your sleep preferences, and even caffeine habits, and it creates a personalized plan which integrates most of the principles we talked about in this podcast to adjust your circadian rhythm. It gives you sort of step-by-step prompts like when to seek bright light, when to avoid it, when to nap, and when to cut out caffeine so your body clock lines up with your work hours. I personally find it quite useful so that I don't need to really think about it. It just gives me reminders for all the sleep-related things that I need to do. It's free for a month, and then I think it's about $10 a month or $25 a year, which again, I think is pretty well worth it. I think if you're serious about optimizing your sleep, it's definitely worth trying. So when you're pulling off your 5th overnight this month or trying to switch back to days, remember, circadian disruption is a hazard, but it is manageable. With the right strategies, from caffeine timing to casino shifts to light strategies and napping, you can take back control of your sleep, protect your brain and body, and perform your best where it counts, in the ED. So until next time, stay safe, stay rested, and keep bringing your best self to the emergency department.